introductions. We wanted to thank our moderator, Matthias van der Weilen of FHIR, and also introduce our speakers. We have Wayne Kubick, who is the CTO with HL7, and he also has expertise in organizing virtual pubs, which we all benefited from and enjoyed yesterday. And we also are welcoming Hugh Glover, who has more than 3 decades experience in health informatics roles, from software developer all the way through lead architect. He is partner in Blue Wave Informatics, and he has been heavily involved with HL7 and is currently the co-chair of the Biomedical Research and Regulation Work Group. So I will turn it over now to Wayne and Hugh.
Thank you, Pat, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I realize you could all be doing chair yoga while we're here presenting on clinical research in the FHIR world. I'm going to do a few words of historical background and context, and the major event that we're soon to announce, the creation of a new accelerator in this space. And he will be doing most of the heavy lifting, talking about the types of things we're seeking to do. This particular topic has been very near and dear to my heart. Before joining HL7 4.5 years ago, I spent some 25 years in the biopharma clinical research space. And when I got to that phase, things were quite a mess there. Data was collected on paper forms for clinical research trials. It was actually entered into systems twice on the illusion that transcription errors could be avoided if you entered the same data twice. But it didn't necessarily mean it was quality data. And over the years, they eventually, a period of about 10 years, they learned how to enter their forms into the internet. Don't gone into central databases, but realistically, the data itself was thought to be, from healthcare, it was thought to be relatively useless for research purposes. The data that was available back in the 90s, in fact, through the mid to the early, up to 2010, I would say, often consisted of scanned patient notes, maybe some scanned images, maybe some scanned copies of lab reports, and just lots of scribbles on charts. And this wasn't really useful for research. So the world of research basically started with the idea of putting data on these single case report form pages. There were 3 parts. You can keep a copy at the site. And those forms were organized by what was called in research data domains. We would think of them as aligning very closely with FHIR content resources now. There'd be demographics on one page and vital signs on another and labs on another page. And these things were all filled in. It was the problem with filling it in is that there was no consistency. And I was one of the founding board members and developers of an organization called CDISC, which was established to put together a certain degree of standards of making the way these CRFs were defined consistent and the databases that sat behind them in a consistent format. And that was eventually adopted by the FDA and then later on by the Japanese PMDA, the FDA equivalent, as the means of submitting the data. Now, the problem with that data, we thought it actually made a great deal of improvement to where things were, but it could only go so far. It was grounded in a data format that was established in the early 1980s. And so it's sort of equivalent to your MS-DOS 5.0 computer in terms of its capabilities. And that's still the format that's required today, which is one of the limitations. And the other reality is that as things change, while the pharmaceutical industry settled in on this standard based on a pretty legacy format, the healthcare industry began to change dramatically as we moved into structured data. And originally with the first round of working from V2, HL7 V2 messages, into CDA documents that were organized as structured XML, and then eventually in the second decade of the 2000s, the advent of FHIR. It took a while for the pharma industry to recognize that, by the way, next slide, please, Hugh, while the pharma industry was settling on a standard that was defined back in around 2000, based on a 1980 technology, the world of healthcare information was advancing very, very rapidly and differently. I use the term separate worlds. Hugh will talk to them about parallel worlds, but I didn't really see them being parallel at all. I mean, parallel would be alignment, but really we were sort of like, pharma was up here and healthcare was all over the place. And then over time, healthcare began to become more consistent as we put the first generation, second generation, and now FHIR, the third generation of standards, which did a number of things, made the data in a structured, accessible format. It could be reused. It was overlapping with the data that was collected on these case reports forms in pharma. And in fact, there was always a problem with collecting the data with inconsistencies with healthcare because part of the pharmaceutical research process required monitoring and confirming that the data on the form is the same data that's in the EHR system. And as the EHR data got better and better, more sophisticated, the pharma data kept pretty stable. So we have this sort of world where healthcare is now passed beyond and moved upward, while pharma clinical research has been pretty steady and flat. And the reality is it's taken some time, and over the last 4 years since joining HL7, I spent a lot of time trying to get people to pay attention, saying, hey, you know, it's important that we now learn how to leverage this HL7 FHIR standard to really improve and ultimately completely transform the way we do research. And you know, my reason for coming to HL7 was twofold. One was my exposure to FHIR, which really was the most exciting thing I'd seen in technology. But the other one is this vision that HL7 holds, which is a world in which everyone can securely access and use the right health data when and where they need it. And we say everyone, we mean people like David Brockart's crowd and patients who can use their data. We mean researchers as well as providers and payers. And so that's what we're trying to do with FHIR. It's really a flag we can all rally around to really make a difference in the way we deal with the world of healthcare. Next slide, Hugh. So over the years of trying to build up interest, we finally got to the point where we built up a community of interest around the pharma research, not just pharma, but actually the full clinical research department organization's environment. And this is turning into what is a new HL7 FHIR Accelerator under the name of Vulcan. HL7 accelerators were communities of interest that sort of revolved around a certain collection of topics to use FHIR, develop implementation guides in order to solve specific business problems in these topical spaces. And so the first of these was Project Argonaut, which was really oriented around how can we use patient FHIR-based APIs to deliver data to patient and exchange it between providers. Da Vinci was the second one, which was organized around the concept of how can we use the FHIR APIs to deal with the entire payer community and payer provider problems. Karen Alliance was associated with that too, as sort of ways to put controls around getting patient data or getting data to patients and between payers. And we have a couple others of relevance to the research community. Codex, there was a presentation yesterday on that, or maybe Monday, dealing with oncology data and data representation and detailed models. And the last one, Gravity, which is dealing with social determinants of health, and they're in more of a content, more closer to a terminology model type and accelerator. But the idea there is to get a handle around that information so it can be brought into the research community as well. And last September, there was agreement on a cross-discipline group that's going to work together to build a similar accelerator under the name of Vulcan to help make FHIR effective to well, improve and ultimately totally transform the way we do research. Next slide, please. This is one of the standard slides indicating the composition of the Vulcan community. And so HL7 is one of the principal sponsors, but my former organization, CDISC, is also involved in this. We have active involvement from numerous government agencies, including the FDA and the National Institutes of Health. We're working on getting the European Medicine Authority involved as well as the Japanese PMDA. We've got a patient constituency, Debbie Willis, who is also co-chair of our patient work group, patient advocacy work group, or patient empowerment work group, is also involved, as well as several others in the patient community. We have research academia, particularly from the translational research community, a number of the National Institutes of Health agencies, the National Library of Medicine, and working on getting, again, more academic involvement around the world as well. Technology vendors within the HR space, as well as within the clinical research space and under industry groups as well. So the idea is to get all these groups together, working together as a community of interest to really figure out how we can use FHIR to change the way we do things. Next slide, please. My last one. And this is kind of motherhood and apple pie. I wouldn't spend too much time reading about the details. It's kind of what most for the most part, it's what all accelerators try to do, is basically try to bridge the gaps and put together the right people who can work together to make a difference and to reuse as much as possible. which is kind of the critical point. There's so much that has happened and has advanced in the world of healthcare, a great deal of it due to FHIR. It's a much better technology. It's a much richer tool set. It's a very, very active community. We should be able to leverage that to improve the research, the world of research as well. And we want to ultimately be able to have the tools and solutions that will make it possible. This notion of community, you know, and Graham will over and over emphasize this is what's most critical about FHIR. Sarah Novotny's talk this morning on open source kind of hit the key points of it too. And we're trying to bring this is kind of a new concept to the research world, which tends to be kind of rather protective over time and sort of controlling of their information. But the notion of working together to make things happen is really how you can effect major change. And the idea is that there's so much that's happened in healthcare that can be now applied to the way we do research. We just need to change our frame of reference and look at better ways to do that. We really want to see research becoming not just for randomized clinical trials or observational trials in the active community, but really what's envisioned by those who discuss the learning health system, where almost any time a patient, particularly the notion of the time now of COVID-19, every patient comes in for treatment or for diagnosis, and who is given a different type of treatment, we need to know what's happening real time, near real time, because we need to adapt in the course of a pandemic. And so it's never been more important to do this than now. And so I'm really gratified to see that we're finally getting some energy and momentum going and looking forward to presenting at future DevDays with a lot more concrete advances so that we can slowly get the world of research to catch up to healthcare as healthcare continues charging ahead. Hugh, over to you.
Thank you, Wayne. So, right. I'm going to tackle this in from a sort of startup perspective. I've been involved in healthcare for a very long time now. I started off with drug databases, and when we were first constructing a drug database for the UK, the thing that was characteristic was that I kept getting people ring up and say, we're launching a new prescribing system on Wednesday and we've just decided we'd like to put a drug database in it. Can you supply one, please? And that happened over and over again. That was a time when there were a lot of people who were seeing this as a bandwagon that they could jump on. I think in the UK at one time had 125 different prescribing systems, all of them competing for the same market. So what's that got to do with Vulcan and how does that tie in? Well, Vulcan, as you saw on the earlier slide, has got some pretty large organizations in it. You know, the FDA is a pretty heavy-duty organization. Most pharma companies are pretty heavy-duty organizations. I've been working over the last few years with one of the clinical research organizations. I'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. But again, they're large organizations. We had, I think, 42 sprint teams. You can't be actually that agile when you've got 42 sprint teams. But one of the characteristics I see within the FHIR community is people coming to this saying, this is something I can pick up quickly and I can do something and I can get something started. And it would be an enormous benefit to the pharma industry as a whole and benefit to individuals if we could get something of that startup company mindset getting involved with what Vulcan is doing and some of the objectives. So I'm not going to talk about the big heavy duty projects that might be in Vulcan and the big things that might go on. What I want to try and do is give a little bit of background to clinical research on the assumption that it's probably not something you're that familiar with, and give you some pointers to areas that I think there could be FHIR apps developed really quite quickly and easily, which have got a potential market within this overall industry. So hopefully, if we can do that, then we will live long and prosper, as Dr. Spock would say. So as Wayne said, he talks about different universes or different worlds. I talk about parallel universes. I think they're parallel because we're talking so often about similar concepts. We deal with the same items. We're dealing with patients who need to be made better, patients who are sick, who need treatment, patients who are going to get given drugs and procedures that will lead to them, hopefully, getting better. But some of the things that we are used to talking about in a clinical care context actually just don't work in quite the same way. And there are subtleties to them. And that's one of the areas where people can trip up. There's also a difference, I think, in the way that FHIR is focused. If we look at it from a clinical research perspective, FHIR is very, very much focused on an individual patient. It's quite hard to do a lot of FHIR stuff unless you're making a mention of a patient of some sort. And yet clinical research really is focused on clinical trials. Yeah, they involve patients, but it's actually the trial that we're trying to deal with. And there are lots of things that go on within trials that actually don't have anything to do with patients. That doesn't mean that we need a completely different set of resources, but it means that we possibly need to think about resources in a slightly different way or make slightly different use of them. So in a clinical care setting, a very simplified process would be take a history, give a suitable treatment and see what happens. In other words, you've got a condition resource, you've got a medication administration resource, you've got an observation resource. And I'm grossly simplifying. There's obviously vastly more things go into that. Look at it from a clinical research perspective. Well, we're looking to find a new drug. We're looking to give it to a whole population of patients. And we're looking to see what happens to that population of patients, by and large, in general. We know we'll have a few oddities, but if something happens to 95% of those patients, that really is quite a strong signal that that drug does something useful. And yet the resources we'd probably be using for that are medication, well, that's a standard resource. Medication administration, it's just the same thing. And observations. So we've got very much the same overall pattern. So what I want to encourage people to do is to go where we haven't gone before. Wayne said I had to have a picture on this slide. So you probably picked up there's a whole Trekkie theme behind Vulcan. So there's your picture of Starship Enterprise, and that's where we're going to set off to do. So let's look at a simple clinical trial. I said earlier that there are these things called clinical research organizations. We tend to think, if we've not been involved in the industry, that clinical trials get run by drug companies. But in reality, the vast majority of clinical trials are actually farmed out to either academic institutions or to these clinical research organizations who exist purely for the purpose of conducting clinical trials on behalf of pharma companies. They've got an awful lot of business and an awful lot of process that goes on within them. So let's just look at the steps that they will go through. So starting off our trial for exoticillin. First thing we need to do is find 15 sites across 3 different countries. So here's the sites we're finding, they're popping up as green stars. And yeah, we've gone through there, and I think if you count them up, there might actually be slightly more than 15. Okay, so we've done that. Well, now we need to make sure those sites are actually valid, because what happens is that you start looking for sites and people come along and say, Yeah, I run a clinic or a hospital, and this is one of my specialities, and I'd really like to take part in this trial. And yeah, I could do all of that. Somebody then needs to actually go along and make sure that that site is capable of running that trial. The simple-minded example is that they need a particular type of scanner as part of the analysis that's going to get done through the trial. Has that site got that scanner? So a set of monitors will go from the clinical research organization and check each of the sites and see that they really got what they said they had. And actually, there's 2 of them don't have all the facilities they claimed they had. So we've actually only got, I think, 13 sites now. Well, 13 sites is nearly 15. That's actually good enough. Right, we now need to recruit 250 subjects into our trials, and we call them subjects, not patients. We need 250. Well, actually, we've only found 212. Well, yeah, 250 was just a sort of what we'd like to have. Doesn't have to be exact. 212 will do. Then we go through and we do a similar sort of validation process. You know, perhaps our trial requires that each of the subjects has never had an episode of asthma. You go and check on the subjects that have been recruited. Well, actually, they've got asthma, so they have to come off. So now we're down to 180 subjects that can actually go through the trial. Well, we wanted 250. We went down to 212. Now we're down at 180. There's a process here of evolution of this trial. And there's a process of going through and deciding whether this trial actually is still viable. And there will be a set of criteria. And it will evolve as time goes on. So yeah, let's say, well, 180 is actually good enough. So now we need to supply them with drugs. So maybe this trial is one where patients go into a hospital, get some tests done, and then go home, and over the next 6 months, they take a course of drugs. So they need to be supplied with that once a month. How does the supply get there? These are trial drugs. They actually don't know whether they're taking a drug or a placebo. So what they actually get is a plain white box with a plain white tablet inside it, and it's box A or box B. So you can't go to the pharmacy and collect these. What tends to happen is that they get delivered by courier. And so there has to be a process in place, both for saying, I need some more drugs, please, and for managing the actual supply chain that gets them to that site. There used to be a whole series of voice-driven apps over the telephone. They're inevitably now getting replaced by web-driven apps. Right, now we're at a point where we start to gather some data. We're now at that point where things look quite a lot like you would see in clinical care. We're measuring blood pressures, we're measuring temperatures, we're looking at x-rays, we're doing all those things that you would expect to see that are part of clinical care. And as Wayne said, in the past, this used to be entirely separately done. So if you were having some blood analysis done, even if exactly the same tests were being done as part of your clinical care, you'd end up having 2 blood draws, 2 separate sets of lab analysis to actually do the same set of things and produce the same results. When we've gathered the data in, then we've got to analyze the data. Well, fair enough. And then when we've analyzed the data, we finally get to a point where we want to persuade the regulators that this exoticillin is actually a good drug. So we've got to submit our data to the regulators in a form that they can do something with it. One of the points I think it's worth taking away from this is that I've got 8 steps in this process. It's steps 6, 7, and 8 are the ones that you would probably have thought about if I'd asked you to summarize what goes into a clinical trial in advance. The 5 steps that go before that I think, are all areas where there is potential for people to start building smaller apps and relatively easy apps that might make use of FHIR that have got some potential in the market. I'll run through this slide quickly because I think this just helps understand the flow of things through a clinical trial, so the actual business process and what the different steps are. We've talked about finding investigators, finding sites, finding subjects, drug supply, and actually keeping track of all of the drugs at the end of the process. If I've dished out 500 tablets to somebody, I want to be sure that they've either taken 500 or they've taken 480 and given me 20 back. That's the drug supply process. We talked about that a little bit. There's the data capture that happens as a series of visits. Usually a visit means you've gone somewhere, but you also get visits, as with so many things, that happen virtually. And then there are things you didn't plan on happening, so you've got unscheduled visits as well. And you actually plan for unscheduled visits, which is a slight contradiction, but it's the only way you can manage them within there. All of that has to get stored away in an interim store. It's coming from different sources, so you've got an integration problem within there. All of these things are happening, as we looked at before, to objects in a data sense, which actually are not radically different from things we can identify within FHIR resources. The data then has to go off for analysis and then to submission. And one of the curiosities of this is that so much of the analysis actually gets done through some relatively old statistical packages and is done by a stats department, and people wanting to have the analysis done say what analysis they'd like to have done, wait for 24 hours or more to get an answer to come back, and then have to go around the loop again because it wasn't quite what they wanted to ask in the first place. So it's another area where there's potential for improvement. And all the time sitting at the bottom of this, you've got this patient that's actually going through a clinical care process at the same time. And I think the parallels between the two are fairly obvious. One of the common areas that gets talked about, and one of the areas that Vulcan at the moment talks a lot about, is real-world data. So data that is being captured through normal clinical care, maybe data that's being captured through wearable devices of one sort and another. But it's all stuff that we ought to be able to make use of as part of our research process. We ought to be able to monitor how patients are going on over longer periods of time at a lower cost with less intrusion into their lives, all by pulling the data from these devices or from other existing records and sending it off to some central point and making reuse of that data. It's a large-scale operation when you come to do that sort of process. This is not the sort of thing where somebody sits down in a corner with a couple of their mates and are able to put something together that demonstrates that there's large-scale integration of real-world data is something they can do. I think this is something that fits within the larger corporate worlds where they've already got data capture processes of one sort and another. I hope somebody comes out and proves me wrong, but I think that sort of sits off at the corporate end. Adverse event recording, so you've suddenly got a headache after taking a particular drug. Is that part of the small scale stuff you can do? Well, yeah, you probably can do that with Smart on FHIR apps. You could probably do that with very simple apps that let people just do their own recording of the things they were concerned about. But if you want to start really pulling things out from existing EHR systems, I'd suggest that that's probably something that comes out of the large-scale corporate world again. But going back to some of these other things I've talked about before, so logistics, recruitment, and so on, I think those are all areas that have got potential on a startup basis. So I'm not going to go through this in detail to explain exactly how I would set about doing supply logistics, partly because I haven't gone through all the analysis myself, partly because we don't have time. But here are the steps, here are the things that if you could do all of this through an app that sent its data off by FHIR, I think you might have a real potential to get people interested in it. So your subject gets a supply of their trial medication. They're going to record when that arrives. They're going to record when they take the medication. Periodically, they're going to need to go and order some more. And then at the end of it, you've got to keep track of how much they were delivered, how much they said they've taken, and how much you've got sent back at the end, and does all that match up. The little blue boxes off to the side are the sort of standard FHIR resources that I think go into that. So research subject, research study, activity definitions, medicinal product, observation. They're all fairly standard things, nothing odd within those. Recruiting sites to join a trial. We're not got any patients in here. This is purely on the basis of finding locations and finding principal investigators, doctors in other words, who want to get involved in this. There's going to be a claim for payment for this. There's going to be a recording that they've been paid. And there's actually a blacklisting process because some people don't do very well. They say, I can get you 50 patients, and actually they only get 10. And they regularly do that. They go on a blacklist and they don't get asked to do that. Again, I think that's a fairly straightforward process.
We do have about 5 minutes left, Hugh.
Okay, thank you. So, schedule activities. What's actually going to go on within a trial? How is this going to run through? You've got a whole series of things, protocol, study drug, sorry, the protocol, the study drug, and the schedule of activities all make use of the plan definition resource. And then you've got a series of other resources that get put together to build that one up. And lastly, essentially same set of resources, but now monitoring what's going on within that and how does all that function. So if we take all of those resources and put them together into the big picture, you get this sort of linkage together across them. So our research subject being our core, the basic thing that each individual set of data is pulled together around. They're part of a research study. You've got investigators, you've got your schedule activities hanging on around it. We didn't talk about consent, but there's a consent process as well. All of these are standard resources. So I think most of the materials are there ready to actually get started. So I'd encourage people, give this a try. I think you will find that there are companies, big companies, who would be interested in looking at the small scale stuff that can actually be done. And who knows, you may prosper as a consequence. Thank you.
All right, and thank you, Wayne and Hugh, for the presentation today, and thank you, Matthias, for moderating. Please note that if you did ask any questions in the Q&A and they weren't answered yet, they will be persistent. So we'll make sure that those get answered there. And thank you very much for attending. Check the agenda in the Whova app to get to your next meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.